The Man in Lower 10, Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Chapter 15. The Cinematograph. On Monday, I went out for the first time. I did not go to the office. I wanted to walk. I thought fresh air and exercise would drive away the blue devils that had me by the throat. McKnight insisted on a long day in his car, but I refused. "I don't know why not," he said sulkily. "I can't walk. I haven't walked 2 consecutive blocks in 3 years. Automobiles have made legs mere ornaments. And some, not even that. We could have Johnson out there chasing us over the country at $5 an hour." "He can chase us just as well at 5 miles an hour," I said. "But what gets me, McKnight, is why I am under surveillance at all. How do the police know I was accused of that thing?" "The young lady who sent the flowers, she isn't likely to talk, is she?" "No, that is, I didn't say it was a lady." I groaned as I tried to get my splintered arm into a coat. "Anyhow, she didn't tell," I finished with conviction, and McKnight laughed. It had rained in the early morning, and Mrs. Clopton predicted more showers. In fact, so firm was her belief, and so determined her eye, that I took the umbrella she proffered me. "Never mind," I said. "We can leave it next door. I have a story to tell you, Richie, and it requires proper setting." McKnight was puzzled, but he followed me obediently round to the kitchen entrance of the empty house. It was unlocked, as I had expected. While we climbed to the upper floor, I retailed the events of the previous night. "It's the finest thing I ever heard of," McKnight said, staring up at the ladder and the trap. "What a vaudeville skit it would make. Only you ought not to have put your foot on her hand. They don't do it in the best circles." I wheeled on him impatiently. "You don't understand the situation at all, Richie," I exclaimed. "What would you say if I tell you it was the hand of a lady? It was covered with rings." "A lady," he repeated. "Why, I'd say it was a darned compromising situation, and that the less you say of it, the better. Look here, Lawrence, I think you dreamed it. You've been in the house too much. I take it all back. You do need exercise." "She escaped through this door, I suppose," I said, as patiently as I could. "Evidently down the back staircase. We might as well go down that way. According to the best precedents in these affairs, we should find a glove about here," he said as we started down. But he was more impressed than he cared to own. He examined the dusty steps carefully, and once, when a bit of loose plaster fell just behind him, he started like a nervous woman. "What I don't understand is why you let her go," he said, stopping once, puzzled. "You're not usually quixotic." "When we get out into the country, Richie," I replied gravely, "I'm going to tell you another story, and if you don't tell me I'm a fool and a craven on the strength of it, you are no friend of mine." We stumbled through the twilight of the staircase into the blackness of the shuttered kitchen. The house had the mouldy smell of closed buildings. Even on that warm September morning, it was damp and chilly. As we stepped into the sunshine, McKnight gave a shiver. "Now that we are out," he said, "I don't mind telling you that I've been there before. Do you remember the night you left? And the face at the window?" "When you speak of it, yes." "Well, I was curious about that thing," he went on, as we started up the street, "and I went back. The street door was unlocked, and I examined every room. I was Mrs. Clopton's ghost that carried a light and clum." "Did you find anything?" "Only a clean place rubbed on the window opposite your dressing room. Splendid view of an untidy interior. If that house is ever occupied, you'd better put stained glass in that window of yours." As we turned the corner, I glanced back. Half a block behind us, Johnson was moving our way slowly. When he saw me, he stopped and proceeded with great deliberation to light a cigar. By hurrying, however, he caught the car that we took and stood unobtrusively on the rear platform. He looked fagged and absent-mindedly paid our fares, to McKnight's delight. "We will give him a run for his money," he declared as the car moved countryward. "Conductor, Let us off at the muddiest lane you can find. At 1 o'clock, after a 6-mile ramble, we entered a small country hotel. We had seen nothing of Johnson for a half hour. At that time, he was a quarter of a mile behind us and losing rapidly. Before we had finished our luncheon, he staggered into the inn. One of his boots was under his arm, and his whole appearance was deplorable. He was coated with mud, streaked with perspiration, and he limped as he walked. He chose a table not far from us and ordered scotch. Beyond touching his hat, he paid no attention to us. "I'm just getting my second wind," McKnight declared. "How do you feel, Mr. Johnson? 6 or 8 miles more, and we'll all enjoy our dinners." Johnson put down the glass he had raised to his lips without replying. The fact was, however, that I was like Johnson. I was soft from my week's inaction, and I was pretty well done up. McKnight, who was a wellspring of vitality and high spirits, ordered a strange concoction made of nearly everything in the bar and sent it over to the detective, but Johnson refused it. "I hate that kind of person," McKnight said pettishly. "Kind of a fellow that thinks you're going to poison his dog if you offer him a bone." When we got back to the car line, with Johnson a draggled and drooping tail to the kite, I was in better spirits. I had told McKnight the story of the 3 hours just after the wreck. I had not named the girl, of course. She had my promise of secrecy. But I told him everything else. It was a relief to have a fresh mind on it. I had puzzled so much over the incident at the farmhouse and the necklace in the gold bag that I had lost perspective. He had been interested but inclined to be amused until I came to the broken chain. Then he had whistled softly. "But there are tons of fine gold chains made every year," he said. "Why in the world do you think that the smeary piece came from that necklace?" I had looked around. Johnson was far behind, scraping the mud off his feet with a piece of stick. "I have the short end of the chain in the sealskin bag," I reminded him. "When I couldn't sleep this morning, I thought I would settle it, one way or the other. It was hell to go along the way I had been doing. And there's no doubt about it, Rich. It's the same chain." We walked along in silence until we caught the car back to town. "Well," he said finally, "you know the girl, of course, and I don't. But if you like her, and I think myself you're rather hard hit, old man, I wouldn't give a whoop about the chain in the gold purse. It's just one of the little coincidences that hang people now and then. And as for last night, if she's the kind of a girl you say she is, and you think she had anything to do with that, you're addled. That's all. You can depend on it, the lady of the empty house last week is the lady of last night, and yet your train acquaintance was in Altoona at that time." Just before we got off the car, I reverted to the subject again. It was never far back in my mind. "About the young lady of the train, Rich," I said, with what I suppose was elaborate carelessness. "I don't want you to get a wrong impression. I am rather unlikely to see her again, but even if I do, I believe she is already bespoke, or next thing to it." He made no reply, but as I opened the door with my latchkey, he stood looking up at me from the pavement with his quizzical smile. "Love is like the measles," he orated. "The older you get it, the worse the attack." Johnson did not appear again that day. A small man in a raincoat took his place. The next morning, I made my initial trip to the office, the raincoat still on hand. I had a short conference with Miller, the district attorney, at 11. Bronson was under surveillance, he said, and any attempt to sell the notes to him would probably result in their recovery. In the meantime, as I knew, the Commonwealth had continued the case, in hope of such contingency. At noon, I left the office and took a veterinarian to see Candida, the injured pony. By 1 o'clock, my first day's duties were performed, and a long Sahara of hot afternoons stretched ahead. McKnight, always glad to escape from the grind, suggested a vaudeville, and in sheer ennui, I consented. I could neither ride, drive, nor golf, and my own company bored me to distraction. "Coolest place in town these days," he declared. "Electric fans, breezy songs, airy costumes, and there's Johnson just behind, the coldest proposition in Washington." He gravely bought 3 tickets and presented the detective with one. Then we went in. Having lived a normal, busy life, the theatre in the afternoon is to me about on a par with ice cream for breakfast. Up on the stage, a very stout woman in short pink skirts with a smile that McKnight declared looked like a slash in a roll of butter was singing nasally with a laborious kick at the end of each verse. Johnson, 2 rows ahead, went to sleep. McKnight prodded me with his elbow. "Look at the first box to the right," he said in a stage whisper. "I want you to come over at the end of this act." It was the first time I had seen her since I put her in the cab at Baltimore. Outwardly, I presume I was calm, for no one turned to stare at me, but every atom of me cried out at the sight of her. She was leaning, bent forward, lips slightly parted, gazing raptly at the Japanese conjurer who had replaced what McKnight disrespectfully called the columns of Hercules. Compared with the draggled lady of the farmhouse, she was radiant. For that first moment, there was nothing but joy at the sight of her. McKnight's touch on my arm brought me back to reality. "Come over and meet them," he said. "That's the cousin Miss West is visiting, Mrs. Dallas." But I would not go. After he went, I sat there alone, painfully conscious that I was being pointed out and stared at from the box. The abominable Japanese gave way to yet more atrocious performing dogs. "And how many offers of marriage will the young lady in the box have?" The dog stopped sagely at none, and then pulled out a card that said 8. Wild shouts of glee by the audience. "The fools," I muttered. After a little, I glanced over. Mrs. Dallas was talking to McKnight, but she was looking straight at me. She was flushed, but more calm than I, and she did not bow. I fumbled for my hat, but the next moment I saw that they were going, and I sat still. When McKnight came back, he was triumphant. "I've made an engagement for you," he said. "Mrs. Dallas asked me to bring you to dinner tonight, and I said I knew you would fall all over yourself to go. You are requested to bring along the broken arm and any other souvenirs of the wreck that you may possess." "I'll do nothing of the sort," I declared, struggling against my inclination. "I can't even tie my necktie, and I have to have my food cut for me." "Oh, that's all right," he said easily. "I'll send Stogie over to fix you up, and Mrs. Dal knows all about the arm." I told her. Stogie is his Japanese factotum, so called because he is lean, a yellowish-brown in color, and because he claims to have been shipped into this country in a box. The cinematograph was finishing the program. The house was dark, and the music had stopped, as it does in the circus, just before somebody risks his neck at so much a neck in the dip of death, or the 100-foot dive. Then, with a sort of shock, I saw on the white curtain the announcement, "The next picture is the doomed Washington Flyer, taken a short distance from the scene of the wreck on the fatal morning of September 10th. 2 miles farther on, it met with almost complete annihilation. I confessed to a return of some of the sickening sensations of the wreck. People around me were leaning forward with tense faces. Then the letters were gone, and I saw a long, level stretch of track, even the broken stone between the ties standing out distinctly. Far off, under a cloud of smoke, a small object was rushing toward us and growing larger as it came. Now it was on us, a mammoth in size, with huge drivers and a colossal tender. The engine leaped aside, as if just in time to save us from destruction, with a glimpse of a stooping fireman and a grimy engineer. The long train of sleepers followed. From a forward vestibule, a porter in a white coat waved his hand. The rest of the cars seemed still wrapped in slumber. With mixed sensations, I saw my own car, Ontario, fly past, and then I rose to my feet and gripped McKnight's shoulder. On the lowest step, at the last car, 1 foot hanging free, was a man. His black derby hat was pulled well down to keep it from blowing away, and his coat was flying open in the wind. He was swung well out from the car, his free hand gripping a small valise, every muscle tense for a jump. "Good God, that's my man," I said hoarsely as the audience broke into applause. McKnight half rose. In his seat ahead, Johnson stifled a yawn and turned to eye me. I dropped into my chair limply and tried to control my excitement. "The man on the last platform of the train," I said. "He was just about to leap. I'll swear that was my bag." "Could you see his face?" McKnight asked in an undertone. "Would you know him again?" "No. His hat was pulled down and his head was bent. I'm going back to find out where that picture was taken. They say 2 miles, but it may have been 40. The audience, busy with its wraps, had not noticed. Mrs. Dallas and Allison West had gone. In front of us, Johnson had dropped his hat and was stooping for it. "This way," I motioned to McKnight, and we wheeled into the narrow passage beside us, back of the boxes. At the end, there was a door leading into the wings, and as we went boldly through, I turned the key. The final set was being struck, and no one paid any attention to us. Luckily, they were similarly indifferent to a banging at the door I had locked, a banging which I judged signified Johnson. "I guess we've broken up his interference," McKnight chuckled. Stage hands were hurrying in every direction. Pieces of the side wall of the last drawing room menaced us. A switchboard behind us was singing like a tea kettle. Everywhere we stepped, we were in somebody's way. At last we were across, confronting a man in his shirt sleeves, who by dots and dashes of profanity seemed to be directing the chaos. "Well," he said, wheeling on us. "What can I do for you?" "I would like to ask," I replied, "if you have any idea just where the last cinematograph picture was taken. Broken board? Picnickers? Lake?" "No. The Washington Flyer." He glanced at my bandaged arm. "The announcement says 2 miles, McKnight put in, but we should like to know whether it is railroad miles, automobile miles, or policeman miles." "I'm sorry I can't tell you," he replied, more civilly. "We get those pictures by contract. We don't take them ourselves." "Where are the company's offices?" "New York." He stepped forward and grasped a super by the shoulder. "What in blazes are you doing with that gold chair in a kitchen set? Take that piece of pink plush there and throw it over a soapbox if you haven't got a kitchen chair." I had not realized the extent of the shock, but now I dropped into a chair and wiped my forehead. The unexpected glimpse of Allison West, followed almost immediately by the revelation of the picture, had left me limp and unnerved. McKnight was looking at his watch. "No," he says, "the moving picture people have an office downtown. We can make it if we go now." So he called a cab, and we started at a gallop. There was no sign of the detective. "Upon my word," Ritchie said, "I feel lonely without him." The people at the downtown office of the cinematograph company were very obliging. The picture had been taken, they said, at M, just 2 miles beyond the scene of the wreck. It was not much, but it was something to work on. I decided not to go home, but to send McKnight's Jap for my clothes and to dress at the incubator. I was determined, if possible, to make my next day's investigations without Johnson. In the meantime, even if it was for the last time, I would see her that night. I gave Stogie a note for Mrs. Clopton, and with my dinner clothes, there came back the gold bag, wrapped in tissue paper. Chapter 16. The Shadow of a Girl. Certain things about the dinner at the Dallas house will always be obscure to me. Dallas was something in the fish commission, and I remember his reeling off fish eggs in billions while we ate our caviar. He had some particular stunt he had been urging the government to for years. Something about forbidding the establishment of mills and factories on riverbanks. It seems they kill the fish, either the smoke or the noise, or something they pour into the water. Mrs. Dallas was there, I think. Of course, I suppose she must have been. And there was a woman in yellow. I took her in to dinner, and I remember she loosened my clams for me so I could get them. But the only real person at the table was a girl across in white, a sublimated young woman who was as brilliant as I was stupid, who never by any chance looked directly at me, and who appeared and disappeared across the candles and orchids in a sort of halo of radiance. When the dinner had progressed from salmon to roast, and the conversation had done the same thing, from fish to scandal, the yellow gown turned to me. "We have been awfully good, haven't we, Mr. Blakely?" she asked. "Although I am crazy to hear, I have not said wreck once. I'm sure you must feel like the survivor of Waterloo or something of the sort." "If you want me to tell you about the wreck," I said, glancing across the table. "I'm sorry to be disappointing, but I don't remember anything." "You are fortunate to be able to forget it." It was the first word Miss West had spoken directly to me, and it went to my head. "There are some things I have not forgotten," I said over the candles. "I recall coming to myself some time after, and that a girl, a beautiful girl—" "Ah!" said the lady in yellow, leaning forward breathlessly. Miss West was staring at me coldly, but once started, I had to stumble on. "That a girl was trying to rouse me, and that she told me I had been on fire twice already." A shudder went around the table. "But surely that isn't the end of the story," Mrs. Dallas put in aggrievedly. "Why, that's the most tantalizing thing I ever heard." "I'm afraid that's all," I said. "She went her way, and I went mine. If she recalls me at all, she probably thinks of me as a weak-kneed individual who faints like a woman when everything is over." "What did I tell you?" Mrs. Dallas asserted triumphantly. "He fainted, did you hear? When everything was over. He hasn't begun to tell it." I would have given a lot by that time if I had not mentioned the girl. But McKnight took it up there and carried it on. "Blakely is a regular geyser," he said. "He never spouts until he reaches the boiling point, and by that same token, although he hasn't said much about the lady of the wreck, I think he is crazy about her. In fact, I am sure of it. He thinks he has locked his secret in the caves of his soul, but I call you to witness that he has it nailed to his face. Look at him." I squirmed miserably and tried to avoid the startled eyes of the girl across the table. I wanted to choke McKnight and murder the rest of the party. "It isn't fair," I said as coolly as I could. "I have my fingers crossed. You are 5 against 1. "And to think that there was a murder on that very train," broke in the lady in yellow. "It was a perfect crescendo of horrors, wasn't it? And what became of the murdered man, Mr. Blakely?" McKnight had the sense to jump into the conversation and save my reply. "They say good Pittsburghers go to Atlantic City when they die," he said. "So we are reasonably certain the gentleman did not go to the seashore." The meal was over at last, and once in the drawing-room it was clear we hung heavy on the hostess's hands. "It is so hard to get people for bridge in September," she wailed. "There is absolutely nobody in town. 6 is a dreadful number." "It's a good poker number," her husband suggested. The matter settled itself, however. I was hopeless, save as a dummy. Miss West said it was too hot for cards and went out on a balcony that overlooked the mall. With obvious relief, Mrs. Dallas had the card table brought, and I was face to face with the minute I had dreaded and hoped for a week. Now it had come. It was more difficult than I had anticipated. I do not know if there was a moon, but there was the urban substitute for it, the arc light. It threw the shadow of the balcony railing in long black bars against her white gown, and as it swung, sometimes her face was in the light. I drew a chair close so that I could watch her. "Do you know," I said, when she made no effort at speech, that you are a much more formidable person tonight, in that gown, than you were the last time I saw you?" The light swung on her face. She was smiling faintly. "The hat with the green ribbons," she said. "I must take it back. I had almost forgotten." "I have not forgotten anything." I pulled myself up short. This was hardly loyalty to Richie. His voice came through the window just then, and perhaps I was wrong. But I thought she raised her head to listen. "Look at this hand," he was saying. "Regular pianola. You could play it with your feet." "He's a dear, isn't he?" Allison said unexpectedly. "No matter how depressed and downhearted I am, I always cheer up when I see Richie." "He's more than that," I returned warmly. "He is the most honorable fellow I know. If he wasn't so much that way, he would have a career before him. He wanted to put on the doors of our offices, Blakely and McKnight PBH, which is poor but honest. From my comparative poverty to the wealth of the girl beside me was a single mental leap. From that wealth to the grandfather who was responsible for it was another. "I wonder if you know that I had been to Pittsburgh to see your grandfather when I met you," I said. "You?" She was surprised. "Yes. And you remember the alligator bag that I told you was exchanged for the one you cut off my arm?" She nodded expectantly. "Well, in that valise were the forged Andy Bronson notes and Mr. Gilmore's deposition that they were forged." She was on her feet in an instant. "In that bag!" she cried. "Oh, why didn't you tell me that before? Oh, it's so ridiculous, so hopeless. Why, I could—" She stopped suddenly and sat down again. "I do not know that I am sorry after all," she said after a pause. "Mr. Bronson was a friend of my father's. I suppose it was a bad thing for you? Losing the papers?" "Well, it was not a good thing," I conceded. "While we are on the subject of losing things, do you know that I still have your gold purse?" She did not reply at once. The shadow of a column was over her face, but I guessed that she was staring at me. "You have it?" she almost whispered. "I picked it up in the streetcar," I said, with a cheerfulness I did not feel. "It looks like a very opulent little purse." Why didn't she speak about the necklace? For just a careless word to make me sane again. "You," she repeated, horror-stricken, and then I produced the purse and held it out on my palm. "I should have sent it to you before, I suppose, but, as you know, I have been laid up since the wreck." We both saw McKnight at the same moment. He had pulled the curtains aside and was standing looking out at us. The tableau of give and take was unmistakable, the gold purse, her outstretched hand, my own attitude. It was over in a second. Then he came out and lounged on the balcony railing. "They're mad at me in there," he said airily, "so I came out. I suppose the reason they call it bridge is because so many people get cross over it." The heat broke up the card group soon after, and they all came out for the night breeze. I had no more words alone with Allison. I went back to the incubator for the night. We said almost nothing on the way home. There was a constraint between us for the first time that I could remember. It was too early for bed, and so we smoked in the living room and tried to talk of trivial things. After a time, even those failed, and we sat silent. It was McKnight who finally broached the subject. "And so she wasn't at Seal Harbor at all?" "No." "Do you know where she was, Lolly?" "Somewhere near Cresson." "And that was the purse, her purse, with the broken necklace in it?" "Yes, it was. You understand, don't you, Rich, that, having given her my word, I couldn't tell you?" "I understand a lot of things," he said, without bitterness. We sat for some time and smoked. Then Richie got up and stretched himself. "I'm off to bed, old man," he said. "Need any help with that game arm of yours?" "No, thanks," I returned. I heard him go into his room and lock the door. It was a bad hour for me, the first shadow between us, and the shadow of a girl at that. Chapter 17. At the farmhouse again. McKnight is always a sympathizer with the early worm. It was late when he appeared. Perhaps, like myself, he had not slept well, but he was apparently cheerful enough, and he made a better breakfast than I did. It was 1 o'clock before we got to Baltimore. After a half-hour's wait, we took a local for M, the station near which the cinematograph picture had been taken. We passed the scene of the wreck, McKnight with curiosity, I with a sickening sense of horror. Back in the fields was the little farmhouse where Alison West and I had intended getting coffee, and winding away from the track, maple trees shading it on each side, was the lane where we had stopped to rest, and where I had, it seemed presumption beyond belief now, where I had tried to comfort her by patting her hand. We got out at M, a small place with 2 or 3 houses and a general store. The station was a one-roomed affair with a railed-off place at the end where a scale, a telegraph instrument, and a chair constituted the entire furnishing. The station agent was a young man with a shrewd face. He stopped hammering a piece of wood over a hole in the floor to ask where we wanted to go. "We're not going," said McKnight. "We're coming. Have a cigar?" The agent took it with an inquiring glance, first at it and then at us. "We want to ask you a few questions," began McKnight, perching himself on the railing and kicking the chair forward for me. "Or rather, this gentleman does." "Wait a minute," said the agent, glancing through the window. "There's a hen in that crate choking herself to death." He was back in a minute and took up his position near a sawdust-filled box that did duty as a cuspidor. "Now fire away," he said. "In the first place," I began, "do you remember the day the Washington Flyer was wrecked below here?" "Do I?" he said. "Did Jonah remember the whale?" "Were you on the platform here when the first section passed?" "I was." "Do you recall seeing a man hanging to the platform of the last car?" "There was no one hanging there when she passed here," he said with conviction. "I watched her out of sight." "Did you see anything that morning of a man about my size, carrying a small grip and wearing dark clothes and a derby hat?" I asked eagerly. McKnight was trying to look unconcerned, but I was frankly anxious. It was clear that the man had jumped somewhere in the mile of track just beyond. "Well, yes, I did." The agent cleared his throat. "When the smash came, the operator at MX sent word along the wire, both ways. I got it here, and I was pretty near crazy, though I knew it wasn't any fault of mine. I was standing on the track looking down, for I couldn't leave the office, when a young fellow with light hair limped up to me and asked me what that smoke was over there. "That's what's left of the Washington Flyer," I said, "and I guess there's souls going up in that smoke." "Do you mean the first section?" he said, getting kind of greenish-yellow. "That's what I mean," I said. "Split to kindling wood, because Rafferty, on the second section, didn't want to be late." He put his hand out in front of him, and the satchel fell with a bang. "My God!" he said, and dropped right on the track in a heap. I got him into the station and he came around, but he kept on groaning something awful. He'd sprained his ankle, and when he got a little better, I drove him over in Carter's milk wagon to the Carter place, and I reckon he stayed there a spell." "That's all, is it?" I asked. "That's all. Oh no, there's something else. About noon that day, one of the Carter twins came down with a note from him asking me to send a long-distance message to someone in Washington." "To whom?" I asked eagerly. I reckon I forgot the name, but the message was that this fellow, Sullivan was his name, was at M, and if the man had escaped from the wreck, would he come to see him? "He wouldn't have sent that message to me," I said to McKnight, rather crestfallen. "He'd have every object in keeping out of my way." "There might be reasons," McKnight observed judicially. "He might not have found the papers then." "Was the name Blakely?" I asked. "It might have been, I can't say. But the man wasn't there, and there was a lot of noise. I couldn't hear well. Then in half an hour down came the other twin, to say the gentleman was taking on awful and didn't want the message sent. He's gone, of course? Yes. Limped down here in about 3 days and took the noon train for the city. It seemed a certainty now that our man, having hurt himself somewhat in his jump, had stayed quietly in the farmhouse until he was able to travel. But to be positive, we decided to visit the Carter place. I gave the station agent a $5 bill, which he rolled up with a couple of others and stuck in his pocket. I turned as we got to a bend in the road, and he was looking curiously after us. It was not until we had climbed the hill and turned onto the road to the Carter place that I realized where we were going. Although we approached it from another direction, I knew the farmhouse at once. It was the one where Alison West and I had breakfasted 9 days before. With the new restraint between us, I did not tell McKnight. I wondered afterward if he had suspected it. I saw him looking hard at the gatepost which had figured in one of our mysteries, but he asked no questions. Afterward, he grew almost taciturn for him and let me do most of the talking. We opened the front gate of the Carter place and went slowly up the walk. 2 ragged youngsters, alike even to freckles and squints, were playing in the yard. "Is your mother around?" I asked. "In the front room." "Walk in," they answered in identical tones. As we got to the porch, we heard voices and stopped. I knocked, but the people within, engaged in animated, rather one-sided conversation, did not answer. "In the front room. Walk in," quoted McKnight, and did so. In the stuffy farm parlor, 2 people were sitting. One, a pleasant-faced woman with a checked apron, rose, somewhat embarrassed, to meet us. She did not know me, and I was thankful. But our attention was riveted on a little man who was sitting before a table, writing busily. It was Hotchkiss. He got up when he saw us and had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Such an interesting case," he said nervously. "I took the liberty—" "Look here," said McKnight suddenly. "Did you make any inquiries at the station?" "A few," he confessed. "I went to the theater last night. I felt the need of a little relaxation, and the sight of a picture there, a cinematograph affair, started a new line of thought. Probably the same clue brought you gentlemen. I learned a good bit from the station agent." "The son of a gun," said McKnight. "And you paid him, I suppose?" "I gave him $5, was the apologetic answer. Mrs. Carter, hearing sounds of strife in the yard, went out, and Hotchkiss folded up his papers. "I think the identity of the man is established," he said. "What number of hat do you wear, Mr. Blakely?" 7 1/4, I replied. "Well, it's only piling up evidence," he said cheerfully. "On the night of the murder, you wore light grey silk underclothing with the second button of the shirt missing. Your hat had LB in gilt letters inside, and there was a very minute hole in the toe of one black sock." "Hush!" McKnight protested. "If word gets to Mrs. Clopton that Mr. Blakely was wrecked or robbed or whatever it was, with a button missing and a hole in one sock, she'll retire to the old lady's home. I've heard her threaten it." Mr. Hotchkiss was without a sense of humor. He regarded McKnight gravely and went on. "I've been up in the room where the man lay while he was unable to get away, and there is nothing there. But I found what may be a possible clue in the dust heap. Mrs. Carter tells me that in unpacking his grip the other day, she took out of the coat of the pajamas some pieces of a telegram. As I figure it, the pajamas were his own. He probably had them on when he effected the exchange." I nodded assent. All I had retained of my own clothing was the suit of pajamas I was wearing in my bathrobe. "Therefore the telegram was his, not yours. I have pieces here, but some are missing. I am not discouraged, however." He spread out some bits of yellow paper, and we bent over them curiously. It was something like this: "Man with Piquet. BR." We spelled it out slowly. "Now," Hotchkiss announced, "I make it something like this. The P is one of 2 things: pistol, you remember the little pearl-handled affair belonging to the murdered man, or it is pocketbook. I am inclined to the latter view, as the pocketbook had been disturbed and the pistol had not. I took the piece of paper from the table and scrawled 4 words on it. "Now," I said, rearranging them, "it happens, Mr. Hotchkiss, that I found one of these pieces of the telegram on the train. I thought it had been dropped by someone else, you see, but that's immaterial. Arranged this way, it almost makes sense. Fill out that with the rest of the word as I imagine it, and it makes papers, and add this scrap, and you have man with papers, in, lower 10, car 7. Get them." McKnight slapped Hotchkiss on the back. "You're a trump," he said. Is Bronson, of course. It's almost too easy. You see, Mr. Blakely here engaged lower 10, but found it occupied by the man who was later murdered there. The man who did the thing was a friend of Bronson's, evidently, and in trying to get the papers, we have the motive for the crime. There are still some things to be explained." Mr. Hotchkiss wiped his glasses and put them on. "For one thing, Mr. Blakely, I am puzzled by that bit of chain." I did not glance at McKnight. I felt that the hand with which I was gathering up the bits of torn paper was shaking. It seemed to me that this astute little man was going to drag in the girl in spite of me.